The arts have become this luxury good that is overconsumed by too few people. And the pandemic, interestingly enough, was a stress test for the role that arts organizations could play in community and how we serve those communities. As many of you know, depending on what sector you're in, everybody said during the pandemic, I wish we could go back to normal. One of the things I argue is that the arts world should never go back to normal. We should not go back to the world that we had in 2019. As we've heard today, too many things have happened. Social injustices, racial inequities, all of these things have been heightened over the course of the past 3 years. So this idea of going back to the way things were was really not an option. So one of the things that I loved about Calgary as a newcomer here during the pandemic is experiencing how this city was rallying around discovering who it wanted to be when it grew up, talking about diversifying its economy, talking about investing in the downtown. These are these moments of pause that every one of us hopefully took over the past few years to think about how we come out of this stronger. It was a pause and a stress test for the arts community that I wish had been taken better advantage of by more people. The pandemic should have forced the arts world to reevaluate everything about how we do business in terms of who is creating, who is delivering the art, who is consuming the art. Essentially, we should have paused and asked the question, or asked ourselves, how, where, and why community and culture intersect and interact. But as we talk about interaction, one of the things that I find fascinating is that that's the one thing none of us were able to do. One of the global things that was the unifying factor during the pandemic was the sense of isolation, was the sense that we were no longer able to be amongst each other. As we all know, technology has provided far more choices, far more diversity, and the perception of a far more democratic process in terms of how we consume arts and culture. But what was lost in all of that was this social experience, what we're all feeling here today. And this isolation and the cocooning phenomenon that came up, even though it was accelerated during the pandemic, is not new. And because beyond the apparent convenience and sometimes the price point, literally none of us we didn't have an option, we didn't have a choice. Perfect example that has nothing to do with the arts is that from 2019 to 2022, Peloton, for those of you that know Peloton, they grew 10 times over the course of that pandemic. I will be honest and say that I had nothing to do with that growth. But it was this idea that everybody had to consume and find a way to self-sustain themselves within the privacy of their homes. Within 2 years, all of us, for the most part, most of us, could eat, work out, entertain ourselves, and shop without leaving our home. And while this idea of digital programming is something that we were all scrambling to catch up to, I do want to give credit where credit's due, because a lot of us were trying to figure out what's our role in the digital world? How do we all come together? And there is a history and there is a precedent of arts organizations doing it, and I usually call on the one that I find the most inspiring, is the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. For decades, they have found ways of bringing the opera to people. At first it was through radio, then it was through movie theaters, and then recently through in-home, on-demand streaming. But the logic there was they weren't competing with the live experience. They were there to nurture, protect, and to provide for an audience that wanted to go to the in-person option. Even at Arts Commons here, we saw over the course of the past 3 years, certain series of ours triple in viewership because we were able to provide this digital experience. And when we look back on that time of that incredible growth, we know that 80% of those folks that were engaging with us were brand new to our organization. So there were incredible opportunities to be gained. But as we started reemerging from the pandemic, the question then for us was, are we able to retain that 80%? Or how many of those folks that were introduced to us during the pandemic digitally were actually driving demand for the in-person experience? And I think it's not surprising, and those of you that are in the know, you probably have heard a lot of arts organizations around the world say that our audiences are not coming back post-pandemic as fast as we thought or frankly wanted them to. And what's tricky about this is other aspects of the world are coming back. So we need to be somehow mindful of saying, okay, folks may not be rushing back to a concert, or they might not be rushing back to the theater, but for any of us that have been traveling, we know that the first second people got to go to Hawaii, they were cramming themselves into airplanes. They were cramming themselves into airports. In fact, the Canadian government last spring was completely overwhelmed in terms of the demand for new passports from Canadians. And that's not just with traveling. People were filling sports arenas. In fact, the Netflix and Peloton subscribership actually plummeted as the world started reemerging. And yet, for some reason, people were not rushing back to live entertainment or live arts in the same way. And so to me, what that says, or one of the things that I infer from that is, what have we been doing, not just during the pandemic, but for decades, that when given the option, people may not be coming back or engaging with us on the same way? Because I don't know about you all, but as somebody that traveled, I was still fearful about the pandemic. The pandemic is not gone, but whatever residual fears I had did not compare to my desire to want to go visit family, did not compare to my desire to want to get on an airplane and travel again. So why is it all of a sudden that when we give somebody the option of doing it, they don't overcome the same amount of fears that they are doing to do something else? And we think we have an answer. From May of 2020 to December of 2022, researchers around North America interviewed 300,000 patrons of the arts across 50 different markets. And what they discovered was there are three main barriers to people coming back. And I think these are fascinating. In third place, and growing, is financial concerns. And I think those will always be around and we need to juggle with them. In second place, and declining, was a fear of getting COVID or transmitting COVID. And in first place was this idea that people had not been presented with programming that they wanted to attend. So the way that I interpret that data is to say, people in my job, people in organizations that deal with arts and culture, have not presented a strong enough argument for most of us to get our butts off our couch. But regardless of how you interpret the data, it is clear that people are not coming back as quickly to live in-person experiences as they are in other areas of their lives. And so what I posit today, or what I want us to think about, because we think about it all the time, is the slow trickle back to certain experiences post-pandemic. Is it really because of the pandemic, or is this decades in the making of a declining relevance to community? And this begs the question, and now I'm going back to the answer that we were all engaging in earlier. If people aren't coming and engaging with the arts, then what's even the point of creating? I'm a big believer that the arts, particularly the performing arts, we cannot survive, we cannot thrive unless we have audiences sharing physical space with artists. The importance of a shared experience is essentially a social one, and we now know, after 3 years of research, that it impacts our emotional well-being and our mental health. And yet we have become the problem in the arts when we treat our work as something that is transactional, something that is a subscription, as opposed to treating it as the social event that people have been missing for so long. And I'd even be willing to say that we have, ironically, as a society, we have consumed more arts and culture in the past 3 years than probably in the history of humankind. And yet we've done it by ourselves, and our sector is hurting for it. Last year, I had the incredible opportunity of sitting on a panel with a mental health practitioner, and we were talking about this very topic. And he turned to me and he said, listen, when we consume arts and culture by ourselves or with people like us, we are essentially living in an echo chamber of our own biases. We pick what we want, we pick topics, we pick experiences, we pick content that reinforce beliefs that we already have. However, when we share space together, whether it's with 10 people, 400 people, 1,000 people, we open ourselves up to experience things differently. I think everybody in this room can relate to a moment when you've been to a concert or a play or a comedy club, and all of a sudden, a lyric, the punchline of a joke, or a line in a script lands completely differently with you than it did with the person beside you. When we have those moments where I laugh and the person next to me didn't, or where they're crying and I'm not, there's a phrase for that. It's actually called emotional referencing. And in the mental health practice, emotional referencing is what actually connects us to people. Our brains start firing differently when we have that experience. It's actually, many medical practitioners think and believe that it's actually the first time that most young people literally experience empathy. And I think we can all agree that without empathy, we don't stand a chance to survive as a society. So now I go back to that question. What's more important, the intent of the artist or the perception of the audience? And obviously it was a trick question. And just so you know, the majority of hands that went up were around the intention of the artist, just in case you weren't looking around. But what I find fascinating is obviously it's a trick question, because the real answer is it's in that tension that we create the magic in this space together. It's that tension that is, interestingly enough, at the core of a vibrant arts community. And interestingly enough, over the past 5 years, that tension between intention and perception has also been gaining traction within the HR community. So this idea of what we intend versus what is perceived is fascinating. And we shy away from that tension when we should actually be leaning into it. And the examples that I always think about are, if an artist creates something by themselves, for themselves, without anticipating or caring how it's going to be received, then I'd be willing to argue that that artist has no desire of engaging with anybody. On the other end of the spectrum, we might have an artist that is so eager to appeal or appease to an audience that they're not willing to challenge anybody's preconceived notions. And so it's really in how do we create a space, a physical space, like we do today, in which artists can come to the table with their artistry, anticipate the dialogue they want to create, and an incredible audience such as you all who are giving so much of yourselves to this dialogue. Holding this tension is what creates meaningful and transformational dialogue. It's that yes and that we've all been talking about today. And I think we can all agree that at a time in society when we are so scared of tension, we just stay away from it. So what role can the arts play in actually bringing people together and building community around tension? I think we've lost the ability to do that as people, as communities, as cities. And so I think it's a valuable exercise for us to realize. Now, because we are polarized, if you had to actually ask me to pick one, if I were answering the trick question that I posed to you, I would actually lean towards the perception of the audience. Because sadly, within the world of arts organizations, in the fairly recent history of arts organizations, it's a very innovative idea. And I think all of us have had this experience where we might have gone to see a show or an orchestra or a concert, and there was this sort of attitude of, well, this is the way the artist intended it. You either get it or you don't. That shuts us off. It kills the dialogue, which I find ironic because when you look back at the history of the arts, especially in the Greek times, here's a community that had embedded theater and music and poetry into the day-to-day politics of life. So why have we forgotten that? We need to prioritize relevance to the audience, which is to say we need to prioritize relevance to community just as much, if not more, than artistic ambition. And I sometimes get in trouble for saying that. Because at the end of the day, our duty, first and foremost, is to build community in and around arts and culture and experiences, and sometimes even tension. There has never been a greater need, I think, in our lifetime to lean in and actually create moments of emotional referencing. The biggest mistake we can make is lean into this idea of transaction and not dialogue. Because if we reduce what we do to, oh, you can watch Netflix or come to a show, we'll never win. Because let's be real, I'm at home watching Netflix. We're all at home watching Netflix. We can't compete with that value proposition. But if instead our value proposition is that we bring people together, we build community, we hold and share space together, nobody can compete with that. The more the world pushes to isolate us, which it is in many ways, and sometimes for good reasons, but the more the world pushes to isolate us, the greater the opportunity is for us to deliver days like today and opportunities like this for us to actually have an in-person experience. So when we approach the future of the arts with this idea of communal participation, collective participation, not as a transaction, we lean ourselves into actually asking questions and not having the answers or pretending that we're entitled to have answers. Let's ask the questions, surround ourselves with the people that we think can answer those questions, and that's how we build community. I think if we accept that artists and arts organizations are civic institutions before they are artistic ones, I think that is the greatest gift we can give to a city or a community, and frankly, it's the only way we'll remain relevant.